Okay, so I'm not going to raise any technical issues about compositionality or that. It's just there is this plain idea about compositionality. That's the idea that the meaning of a complex expression is made out of the meanings of the constituents according to rules. So one way of looking at the situation is by distinguishing two types of semantic rules. Basically the rules which are used, thanks a lot, to provide an interpretation of, say, lexical items. And so when you learn the language, you learn the vocabulary item, you learn what they mean. So you learn to associate an expression with a particular meaning. And we can think of this as a lexical rule that tells us that the meaning, the interpretation I of an expression alpha is something. That's the meaning, M. So we directly associate the meaning to the particular lexical item. That's a sort of brute convention, a lexical convention that we learn when we learn the language. But there is another type of rule that is used to help us understand an expression when it's a complex expression, syntactically complex expression. Then we need another type of rule to understand the expression. And that's a composition rule. That's a rule which determines the content of the complex expression on the basis of the content or meaning of its constituent expressions, the expression out of which it is made. So a composition rule, the formula here means there you have the interpretation of this alpha is something which is given directly. And here you have, say, a complex expression made up of two expressions, alpha and beta, on a particular mode of combination, syntactic combination here. And the rule says that the interpretation of an expression of that type, alpha, beta, with two constituents arranged in a certain way, is a certain function of the interpretation of the expression alpha and the interpretation of the expression beta. So you know already the meanings or interpretations of alpha and beta, and then the rule provides you with a way of determining the meaning of the complex expression made up of alpha and beta. So if you know what alpha means and what beta means, and you know the composition rule for the complex alpha beta, then you are able to determine the meaning of the complex. So that's the general idea. And that entails, and it's an idea that has been extraordinarily successful, in particular in linguistics and semantics, because of course we are able to understand an infinite number of sentences that we've never heard before, and we need a way of calculating the meaning of any such sentence. We can't learn them, we can't just learn the meaning of every sentence individually. We have to construct that meaning out of what we know, which is the meaning of the words in the sentence. So this is accepted more or less by everybody, that something like this is at stake in our comprehension of language. And one consequence is that the meaning of an expression can only be affected by the meanings of its immediate constituents, because each time the meaning depends on the meaning of the immediate constituents. And of course, the meaning of the constituents themselves, if they are complex, depends on the meaning of their constituents. And ultimately, what matters is the meaning of the building blocks that we start from. That meaning we know already because we learned that directly when we learn the lexicon. And we construct all the rest, the meanings of the complex expressions, in terms of those basic meanings. But what that means is that the meaning of an expression depends upon its constituents, and only upon that, in addition to the way they are put together, which the composition rule is sensitive to the syntactic way the expressions are put together. But the idea is that there is no influence of the meaning of the whole, of the complex expression, on the meaning of the parts. It works only one way. So there is the meaning of the parts that sort of contributes to determining the meaning of the complex expressions that are made out of those parts. And there is no influence on so the meaning of an expression doesn't depend upon the meaning of the other expressions on the same level. Again, it's only the meaning of the expressions at below, the expressions out of which a complex expression is made. It is only the meanings of those expressions below that matter and that contribute to determining the meaning of a complex expression. So the meaning of the more complex expression to which a given complex expression belongs doesn't affect the meaning of that complex expression, and the meaning of the neighboring expressions either. So it works only from the bottom to the top, as it were. So that's the idea, and the problem is that we find a lot of counterexamples to to that idea that it works only bottom up. So we find a lot of cases in which, for a given expression, the semantic contribution it makes, its meaning, its intuitive meaning in context, varies from occurrence to occurrence. So the expression, the meaning seems to change depending on a certain additional factor. And in particular, it varies depending on what the other words in the sentence contribute, or what the overall meaning of the sentence is. So precisely, it seems that we find cases of semantic interaction where the meaning of an expression is affected not only by what is below, that is the meaning of the constituent expressions, but also by the neighboring expressions, or even by the complex sentence to which it belongs. So let me give you examples of this. So this is a rather striking example due to Jonathan Cohen. Jonathan Cohen is the old Jonathan Cohen. There is a new Jonathan Cohen. Anyway, so the same verb to drop, same English verb to drop, he says, systematically changes its meanings depending on the sentence in which it's part of, or to which it belongs. So it starts with the sentence, most students here drop geography in their final year. And what that means, he says, what that means is something like they drop studying geography. And then he adds one more word to the sentence. Instead of most students here drop geography in their final year, he has most students here drop geography lectures in their final year. And here drop means drop attending geography lectures. And he continues, most students here drop geography lectures reading assignments in their final year. And here drop means drop executing the assignments. And then he has most students here drop geography lectures reading assignment library fees in their final year. And drop means drop paying those fees. So we find that the word drop means something different in each of these sentences depending on the other words in the sentence. So if you add a word to the sentence, it changes the meaning of drop. But the words in question that have an impact upon the meaning of drop, they are not constituents of the expression drop, which is just a lexical item. So it's the sort of influence that is not predicted by this compositional picture of how meaning is understood. Another case that's well known is from John Searle. So I read the sentence, maybe some of you presumably know the passage. He says, the sort of thing that constitutes cutting the grass is quite different from, for example, the sort of thing that constitutes cutting a cake. If someone tells me to cut the grass and I rush out and stab it with a knife, or if I'm ordered to cut the cake and I run over it with a lawnmower, in each case I will have failed to obey the order. So the idea is that a phrase like cut the cake or cut the grass is such that the word cut makes different semantic contributions in the two cases. There's something common, they are both instances of cutting in a very abstract sense perhaps, but in cut the grass, cut means mow, basically, that is cut in a very specific manner. In cut the cake, cut means slice, that is cut in a very specific manner. It's not the same manner, depending on the complement, the objectual complement. But the problem, again, is that the complement, the object, is not a constituent of the verb cut, so it's hard to know how the meaning of cut may depend upon the object it takes, the direct object, as we say in the old grammatical sense. Another example of so like, you have these two sentences, he likes my sister, he likes roasted pork, and presumably like doesn't mean the same thing in the two contexts. There is this affective sort of liking in the first case and this culinary liking in the other case. And it seems here that the meaning of like depends again upon the complement, the object. And again, same problem, how do we account for that within the sort of framework that I sketched at the beginning? Now, all these examples were examples of in which you have a verb and then the object of the verb as a complement, and the meaning of the verb seems to vary depending on the object. But we find great number of cases in a slightly different construction in which you have an adjective plus a noun. So in the adjective-noun construction, you find that very often the meaning of the adjective depends upon the meaning of the noun. Depends upon the noun. So the same adjective changes its meaning if you change the noun. So for example, a light luggage, a light piece of luggage, and a light sound, they are not light in the same sense at all. a different sense of light. Or a good car and a good house. There used to be, in moral philosophy, a lot of literature about the meaning of good. And the idea is that when you say that something is good, you mean that it's good for a certain type of, it fulfills its function well. That's what it means. But the function is very different depending on the object that you're talking about. So a good car is a car that serves its function as a car well, something like this. While a good house is a house that's good in the way that houses are good, which is a very different way. So good doesn't mean the same thing. At least that's what the people said in this literature. Depending on the noun, the adjective modifies. That's most obvious in the case, one of the really well-known cases, a lot has been written about them, of adjectives like big. So when you say a big mouse and a big elephant, they are not big in the same way, because a big mouse is still not big in the way in which the elephant is big. That is, a big mouse is a mouse that's big for a mouse, but to be big for a mouse is not to be big for an elephant. So it's not the same meaning again. So I'm going to go back to that. Other examples, pink raincoat, pink grapefruits. A pink raincoat, presumably, is a raincoat that's pink on the outside, or maybe not merely on the outside, but at least on the outside. You wouldn't call a raincoat pink if it was not pink on the outside, I suppose. But in the case of a grapefruit, you say pink grapefruit is one that's pink inside. It doesn't have to be pink on the outside. And there are plenty of examples like this with color adjectives. Or the fast typist, fast runner, it's a bit like big or like good. The fast typist is someone who's fast at typing, particular way of being fast. And the fast runner is someone who's fast at running, but not the other way around. So there is no absolute notion here. It seems that it's something more relative, and that's relative to the sort of object that we're talking about, and therefore it seems that the meaning of the adjective is somehow modified or affected by the meaning of the noun. Okay, so there are these phenomena. They are well known, and they're actually very widespread. They are all over the place. It's a very important fact about natural language that there are this phenomena of semantic interaction between the different words in a sentence. Now, is this phenomenon compatible with compositionality? Or rather, let me put it that way. Is it incompatible with compositionality, this idea that the meaning of a complex expression is built out of the meanings of its parts and can only be affected by the meaning of the constituent expressions, not by the meaning of neighboring expression or what's above it, in case the expression is embedded in a larger context. So the way I've just phrased things, obviously that's incompatible. Either you have this bottom-up compositionality in which the meaning of the expression can only be affected by what is below, or you have this phenomenon of semantic interaction, and then that shows that it's not true that meaning precedes composition in natural language. So for example, Jerry Fodor says that they are incompatible. I read the quote from him. The compositionality thesis says that complex representations, he talks of representations, and that applies not only to linguistic representations, also to, well, anyway, let's forget the reason why it says. Complex representations inherit their content from simple ones, not vice versa. It works only one way. So you get simple representation, complex representation made out of them, and the complex representation have their meanings or content determined by that of the constituents. But the contextualist thesis, the idea that says that the meaning of an expression depends upon the context, including the linguistic context in which it occurs. The contextualist thesis says that the content of a simple representation depends on which complex representation it is embedded in, among other things. It depends on a lot of things, including the surrounding, the other words in the sentence, and things like that. And he concludes, clearly, it can be that both are true. Something's got to give, so we have to choose whether we want to maintain compositionality or contextualism. And Jonathan Cohen, the old Jonathan Cohen whom I mentioned, people don't read him very much, but he had a very interesting sequence of papers about those matters. And he thought this conclusion was that we should forget this project of doing a compositional semantics for natural language in the way in which we can do for more languages, maybe. He says, because of this phenomenon of semantic interaction, we cannot construct the semantics for any natural language along the same lines as the semantics for a formal system of any currently familiar kind. Projects like Davidson's or Montagu's cannot succeed. So, and it's important. Actually, projects like Davidson's and Montagu's have played a very important role in theorizing about semantics, and since the time when Cohen wrote, I mean, formal semantics has been a very successful discipline. So it's a problem, this incompatibility. But actually what I want to do here is to deny that there is incompatibility between the two ideas, this compositionality idea and this contextualist idea. And the way we can proceed to sort of support the claim of compatibility is by distinguishing levels of meaning. I think that's the crux. We need to distinguish two levels of meaning. But there are different ways of understanding these two levels, but that will be common to all the ways. There is a distinction between what we may call the standing meaning of an expression, this invariant meaning fixed by the rules of the language. So it can be the verb or the adjective. It has a standing meaning that's fixed by the rules of the language once for all. So that's one thing. And then there is something else, which we may call, echoing Quine, the occasion meaning of the expression when it occurs in a particular context. So a particular occurrence of the expression has a meaning in that context. We call it the occasion meaning, and that has to be distinguished from the standing meaning that the expression has in the language. So that's the important distinction. I think that using that distinction, again, there will be different ways of understanding it, but using that distinction, we can show that there is compatibility between the two ideas. And of course, what's important here is that there is indeed, we have to accept the contextualist point that the meaning of an expression varies and depends upon the other expressions in the sentence, the context in which it occurs, both linguistic and possibly extra-linguistic. But what varies as a function of the other words in the sentence, in the examples I've given, is the occasion meaning. That's not the standing meaning. So cut in cut the grass, cut the cake, that's it, it's always the same standing meaning. But the occasion meaning of the word cut as it occurs in one sentence or the other is different. And the idea is also that this variation and the existence of these influences on meaning from the top or from the other words in the sentence, I call that top-down and lateral influences on occasion meaning, this does not per se, this does not conflict with compositionality. That's what I want to maintain. Okay, so there are different ways, I said, of understanding. So that this is something like this idea was floated very long time ago. So Ed Keenan, not even sure I know where. Some people ascribe the idea to him. I'm not sure I found out where it was. But anyway, his idea was that we have to think of the meaning, or standing meaning of, say, a verb like cut, as something rather abstract, which we can model as a function that takes as argument the sort of object that we're talking about, and that can serve as the object of cut, what is being cut. And when we have fixed this argument, the object that we're talking about, then the value of the function is the occasion meaning of cut. And cut means to cut in the manner in which you cut that sort of thing, basically. So that's what cut means. It means to cut in the manner in which you cut that sort of thing. But that sort of thing is something that really depends upon the complement of cut. If you have cut the grass, then cut means cut in the manner in which you cut grass, that is mow. If you have cut the cake, cut means, the occasion meaning is something like cut in the manner in which you cut cake, that is slice. So that's the general idea, which we can represent this way. To cut something X is to mow it if it is grass, if to slice it if it is a cake, blah, blah, blah. And then you get a list of possibilities, I suppose. Which is an instance of this distinction between standing meaning, which is this thing rather abstract, and occasion meaning. When you have fixed the thing that is said to be cut, then the meaning of cut is made more determinate. Cut means cut in the manner of grass, cut in the manner of capes, something like this. And the same is true for big. So the idea here, when you have big mouse, is that big has a certain standing meaning, that's something fairly abstract. But there is also an occasion meaning of big. But the occasion meaning depends upon something which the standing meaning doesn't provide. So the standing meaning of big would be something like big for an x. But the nature of the x will only be determined by the complement. That is the noun that is being modified. So big mouse would mean a mouse that is big for a mouse. Big elephant would mean an elephant that is big for an elephant. The word big contributes something schematic, like big for an x. And mouse or elephant provide the value of x, which gives us the occasion meaning of big in that context. That's more or less the Keenan idea. And on this view, you see that the occasion meaning of, say, big in big mouse, I said that big means the standing meaning is something abstract like big for an x. The occasion meaning of big in big mouse is something different, namely big for a mouse. And in such a way that a big mouse is a mouse that is big for a mouse, while a big elephant is an elephant that is big for an elephant. So the standing meaning of big in big mouse, big for a mouse, or the occasion meaning of big in big mouse that is big for a mouse, or the occasion meaning of big in big elephant that is big for an elephant. This occasion meaning turns out not to be different from standing meaning in a way. The difference is that big has a certain standing meaning, which is the schematic meaning big for an x. But the meaning, the occasion meaning big for a mouse, which you get when you add the noun that is being modified by big, the occasion meaning of big in big mouse actually is an aspect of the meaning of the complex phrase big mouse. So big for a mouse, that's a meaning that's determined by the standing meaning of big and by the meaning of mouse. When you put these two things together, you obtain the occasion meaning, which is nothing but an aspect of the meaning of the complex phrase. So actually, this is fully compatible with the idea that the meaning of a complex phrase depends upon its constituents. Here, the constituents that include the standing meaning of big and the standing meaning of mouse. And when you put the two together, you get the meaning big for a mouse that's what this property is being ascribed to the mouse. I won't go into the details, because I think that this theory, which is nice, and indeed it shows that this phenomenon of semantic interaction is compatible with standard compositional assumptions. This theory doesn't work because empirically it seems to be wrong, because it says that the meaning of the occasion meaning is really something that's determined compositionally by the standing meanings of the different expressions in the sentence. And it doesn't seem that the phenomenon of semantic interaction that I talked about with the examples I gave can be reduced to just that. Because I said that at the beginning that we find a variation. We find that the meaning of an expression varies depending on the other words in the sentence, the context, and so on. But this phenomenon is not just a matter of variation of the meaning of an expression with the other words in the sentence. Even if we fix the words in the sentence, even if we give us, instead of starting from an isolated word and showing that if we add other words then it would change the meaning, suppose we start from a complete sentence with all the words there. We can still have this variation. The same variation that I mentioned can still occur if we don't change the environment, the linguistic environment. And so let me give you examples. An example with the small elephant. So I started by saying a small elephant or a big elephant. It's not the same thing as a big mouse in the sense that big doesn't mean the same thing in the two cases. In one case it means big for a mouse, in the other it means big for an elephant. And that variation seems to depend upon the noun that is being modified by small or by big. But now I'm now saying, no, this is not just a matter of which noun is being modified. Fix the noun. Suppose the noun is elephant. Suppose you have small elephant. what I said previously suggested that a small elephant has to mean an elephant that is small for an elephant, because of this rule that I gave, the sort of meaning, the sort of standing meaning I gave to big, and that predicts that a small elephant will mean necessarily an elephant that's small for an elephant. But we can find contexts in which that's not what a small elephant means. So this is a context from Hyman Kratzer's textbook and semantics. Imagine we had first introduced a scenario populated with an army of monsters, very big monsters like King Kong. We might then have said something like, Jumbo doesn't have a chance. Jumbo is an elephant. Jumbo doesn't have a chance. He's only a small elephant. And this could have been true even if Jumbo were as large as or even larger than most other elephants. So the idea is that there is this elephant Jumbo. He's not small for an elephant. He's a normal elephant, or perhaps even a big elephant. But compared to the other gigantic monsters, I can say things like, he has no chance. He can't fight. He's only a small elephant. And now a small elephant in this context means an elephant that is small for that sort of a competition, or for, compared to that sort of monster, or something like this. So here, small doesn't mean small for an elephant. So that means that the variation of the meaning of small is not determined mechanically by the complement, by the thing that is the noun it modifies. It may depend upon the extra-linguistic context. Here we know that we are talking about big monsters. And the notion of small has to be understood in the light of this contrast set. And here it's not linguistic, it's not a question of which noun is being modified, it's the extra-linguistic context. And the same is true for the Searle examples, and Searle himself provides the case for showing that a solution a la Keenan will not work. So he gives examples in which you could have cut the cake, and that would mean not cut the cake in a manner of cakes, that is by slicing it, but that would mean take you a lawnmower and do what you do with grass over the cake. And the same is true about cut the grass. So I read the two quotations. Suppose that you and I run a sod farm where we sell strips of grass turf to people who want a loan in a hurry. So basically people, they sell grass, and someone wants some grass, and then you slice. The idea is that you slice a piece of grass for the customer. Suppose I say to you, cut half an acre of grass for this customer. I might mean not that you should mow the grass, but that you should slice it into strips as you could cut a cake or a loaf of bread. So that's a case in which cut the grass means cut the grass in the manner in which you cut a cake. So that's, again, it's the fact that the complement, the object of cut is the grass, doesn't automatically determine the occasion meaning of cut, and that depends also upon the extra-linguistic context. On the other case, suppose we run a bakery where, due to our super yeast strain, whatever that is, our cakes grow upwards uncontrollably. Keep cutting those cakes, I shout to the foreman, meaning not that he should slice them up, but that he should keep trimming the tops off. So that's, well, that's a creative example. Anyway, that shows that it's not just a matter of precisely having certain linguistic rules, like compositional rules, that fit the occasion meaning on the basis of the standing meanings of all the constituent expressions. And similarly, I gave the example of John likes my sister, he likes roasted pork, and now thinking that John is a cannibal, he may well like my sister in the culinary sense. And also talk about good car, which are good, which serve the function of cars well, but you can also speak of a good car where you use the car as a house, so the good would mean good. Well, anyway, let's forget that. Okay, so the conclusion is that the indication provided by the linguistic context, like which noun is being modified, which object is the object of the verb, these indications may always be overridden by the extra-linguistic context. That's exactly what we have in those cases. We are given a piece of extra-linguistic context, and that's enough to change the occasion meaning of the words like cut or small, and so on. And what this shows is that semantic interaction, the phenomenon we're talking about, is ultimately a matter of context dependence, context sensitivity. Sensitivity to the context, that may be the linguistic context, that may be the extra-linguistic context, and actually the linguistic context is just an aspect of the extra-linguistic context, if I may say so. That is, there is the context, and the context comes into all sorts of flavors. But what the phenomenon we have is just this phenomenon that the meaning of a certain expression depends upon the context. And that's something that we are very familiar with, this idea of context sensitivity. So let's construe now the distinction between standing meaning and occasion meaning in this manner. That is, by saying the standing meaning is just the meaning of the expression in the language, and the occasion meaning is the meaning of the expression in context. And that's a distinction we know from studies of indexicality and context sensitivity in language. So in the case of indexicals, we know that a word like I has a standing meaning. It means the same whoever says it, whoever uses it. I always mean the same thing. But when I use it, it refers to me. When you use it, it refers to you. So there is something that depends upon the context, which is the content of the indexical, as opposed to the thing that remains constant, which is, say, the character or the invariant meaning. So we have this distinction, which is very familiar. So why not use that distinction to understand the phenomenon of semantic interaction? And indeed, when I said that the meaning of big can be construed as something schematic, like big for an X, where it's the noun which the adjective modifies, which determines what X is, provides a value for X, we can use this same analysis of the meaning of, say, big as being schematic, big for an X. We can simply say that it's just like for indexicals. For indexical expressions, we often posit in something like a free variable that's part of the standing meaning, a sort of free variable, which has to be given a value in context. So for example, that's an example that was discussed recently. The word enemy. If I say an enemy is approaching, enemy means enemy of X. It's a relational term. But the X has got to be fixed by the context. Presumably, if I say an enemy is approaching, the X is us or me or you, maybe something like this. So the idea is that the same way, we might say that big has a sort of indexical component. There is this free variable, big for X, and we need to find the value of X in order to determine the occasion meaning of big. And the value of the variable will be diffusively determined by the noun being modified, but that's diffusible because the extralinguistic context can override this indication. It's only an indication. So out of context, if you talk about a small elephant, out of context, you understand that as meaning an elephant that's small for an elephant. But in a particular context, you will understand that the X is not elephant, but something like monsters of the sort that we're dealing with. So on this view, semantic interaction reduces to context sensitivity, and we need to posit free variables in the meaning of. And this is compatible with compositionality, and we know that context dependence, context sensitivity is compatible with compositionality. What compositionality says is that the meaning of a complex expression is a function of the meanings of the parts and the way they're put together syntactically. And we don't have the other sorts of influences, top-down or that. The meaning of the parts does not depend upon the meaning of the whole. That is, compositionality works only bottom-up. But this is compatible with the fact that the meaning of the parts, the meaning of the constituents, and in particular the meaning of the basic constituents itself may be context-dependent or context-sensitive. That is, the meaning of the ultimate constituents at the bottom may not be fixed once for all. It may depend upon the context. And now it turns out, so this is again compatible with compositionality because the meaning of the complex expression depends upon what's at the bottom. What's at the bottom itself may depend upon the context in which the words occur. And now the trick is that the whole sentence, the sentence that is being uttered, itself is part of the context. So there is a sort of a double dependence, but again, it's compatible. That is, the meaning of the complex expression depends on the meaning of the constituents. Ultimately depends upon the meaning of the basic expressions. But the meaning of the basic expressions depend upon the context in which the words occur, and the context includes everything. the situation of utterance, but also the words that are being used and all sorts of things. So that gives the impression that there is a form of something that just the opposite of compositionality, but it's not really the case. I mean, the two things work in parallel, as it were. I don't know whether that's very clear. Anyway, let's compare the two theories. The first theory is the Keenan sort of approach. It said that the occasion meaning of an expression is not really the meaning of that expression. It's rather an aspect of the meaning of the complex phrase in which that expression occurs together with the other words. Well, the contextual theory, the sort of indexical theory I've just floated, says that the occasion meaning is the context-dependent content of the expression. And that's determined by the standing meaning of the expression plus the context in which it occurs. So that's the other view. Now, so I said that there was a problem with the first view, that is, it doesn't take into account the extra-linguistic context and the feasible character of the indication provided by the linguistic context. Now, what about the indexical theory that I've just presented? Well, the problem is this idea that a verb like to cut, the meaning of cut, involves something like a free variable, cut for in the manner of x, or the meaning of big would contain a free variable like big for an x. But maybe for big that sort of works. But for the case of cut, I'm very reluctant to say that the meaning of cut involves a free variable, because to say that means that the meaning of cut, the abstract meaning, the standing meaning of cut, is something that's incomplete, like the meaning of an indexical is. The meaning of an indexical is something that really is incomplete. The context must complete something that's not there. And it's as if this metaphor of the free variable to which a value must be assigned, or there is a gap which has to be filled by the context. So that's how we think of indexicals or variables in general. If I say he is very tall, you don't understand what I say unless you assign a value to he. He means something in English, but you don't understand what I say unless in context you are able to assign a particular individual to he as the person I'm talking about. And indexicality is like that. So there is something, the meaning, the expression has a certain meaning, but the context must provide something. And the must means that there is really some incompleteness at the level of the standing meaning, and the context is required to saturate the variable or the gap or whatever. And so that's the picture the picture of indexicals. That's standard pictures. I think that's right, by and large. And I'm reluctant to consider that ordinary words like cut have this property, because there is a sense, an intuitive sense in which cut means cut, and that's not incomplete in the same way. So I don't know, it's an intuition, but there are plenty of examples in which we have, I think it's easy to elicit this intuition. So take the examples. The policeman stopped the car. We find the same variation that I mentioned here. Stop means something different depending on different situations of use. So there are all sorts of situations. First, imagine that the policeman is regulating the traffic. So we understand the policeman stopped the car in that case, and that means something like he gestured towards the driver, indicating that the driver was to stop, and perhaps that ended up in the driver stopping. That would be the sort of meaning of the policeman stopped the car. But suppose that now the policeman is actually driving his own car. Suppose that you have the sentence, the policeman stopped the car, in a context in which it's clear that the policeman is the driver. Then it means something different. The truth conditions are different. That is, the way of stopping is different. In the first case, the policeman stopped the car by signaling to the driver. In the other case, the policeman stopped the car by using the brake or something like this. So those are different manners of stopping. This is similar to the cases we talked about. But I don't have the intuition that stop involves a free variable for a manner of stopping. It seems that stop means stop. In this is causative constructions, and makes it the case that the car stops, something like this. And this is sort of here the stand-in meaning, and that seems to be complete. And indeed, we could find cases, I suppose, contexts in which the policeman stopped the car would not make, it wouldn't be determinate, and it wouldn't matter how the car was stopped. The only thing that matters is that the car was stopped in some manner or other. So it doesn't seem that it's mandatory to provide the manner of stopping. So I think that here what's relevant is a distinction between two types of contextual processes, which I call saturation and modulation. So saturation is the case in which the context provides a value for a free variable in logical form for an indexical. So that's a case in which there is a semantic incompleteness. The context must provide something. Saturation is when the context does provide that thing. So you say he's very tall, and the context determines that you're talking about John. And that, okay, let's forget about tall. So that's saturation. But I think there is something else, something very different from saturation, which I call modulation. And modulation is the case in which you have an expression that has a certain meaning M, and that meaning is mapped to a distant meaning, G of M, where G is a pragmatic function. The idea is that the meaning M may be perfectly all right. It need not be incomplete. But by modulating it, you change it in context to a different meaning in a manner that, again, is not required, is not mandated by the linguistic meaning, by the standing meaning. It's something that you do optionally. Just because in this context, you're not using the words with just their literal meaning, but you're using the words with a modified meaning that's more appropriate to the situation of use. So let me give you examples of that sort of thing. So there are several sub-types of modulation. A free enrichment is the case in which you're using words with a meaning that's more determinate, more restricted than the literal meaning. So take a case like this. Mary likes to wear rabbit. Rabbit means rabbit fur because you have the verb to wear. But you can also say that she likes to eat rabbit, and now rabbit means rabbit meat. So there is a standing meaning of rabbit. In this context, it's a math term, so rabbit means something like rabbit stuff. That's indeterminate, but that's not incomplete. And in certain contexts, you will understand that in a more determinate manner as rabbit fur, rabbit meat. But it's possible also not to specify, as in the well-known example, after the accident, there was rabbit all over the highway. Well, anyway, it's a Gore example. So the idea is that there is the meaning of rabbit, which is something that can be enriched in context. Or this example, this is a bit more controversial. He went to the edge of the cliff and jumped. It's an example, I think, from Robin Carson's dissertation. And we understand jumped as jumped over the cliff. But that's not said literally. The only thing that's said is that he jumped. And there are all sorts of manners of jumping. But here we understand, because of the context, that is, we're talking about the edge of the cliff, we naturally understand the jumping as being over the cliff. So we can understand those examples with cut the grass, cut the cake, stop the car in the same way. That is, stop means stop. It's something that's not incomplete, that's not in need of saturation. But we can understand stop in a more specific manner in context than the literal meaning imposes. Another type of case of modulation in which it's pretty obvious that it's not a matter of saturation of an incomplete meaning, it's a matter of changing the meaning, is the case of a sense extension that is, or broadening or weakening. So when you say the ATM swallowed my credit card, you're not using swallow in the literal sense in which that applies to biological organisms. Here you mean did something similar to swallowing. And here you're sort of broadening, extending the meaning of the literal meaning of swallow. But there is nothing in the meaning of swallow that requires that, of course. Of course not. It's something optional. The same way if you say someone is crazy, you're not saying literally he's literally crazy. You mean that he behaves like a crazy person would do, that is in a slightly irrational manner. And so that's the example for which I wanted to say that this is pretty obvious in this case, that it's different from saturation. That's the case of metonymies or semantic transfers. So when you say the ham sandwich left without pain, you're talking about the person who ordered the ham sandwich. You're using, there is a kind of metonymy Similarly, I'm parked out back. Parked out back is the property of a car, but that's not the property that you're ascribing to yourself. When you say I'm parked out back, the property you're ascribing to yourself is the property that your car is parked out back. So there is a sort of we go from one property to another by a sort of metonymic phenomenon. That's another case of modulation. And clearly, it is very different from a case in which the contextual process is mandated by the linguistic meaning itself. Here, it's not mandated by the linguistic meaning. Linguistic meaning is just what it is. So the suggestion is that perhaps the cases that we like stop, cut, all those cases are cases of modulation, not cases of saturation. That would be, I think, more intuitive. So the general distinction, as I said, between saturation and modulation is that in saturation, the constant or standing meaning of the expression is incomplete, it's unsaturated, and saturation is necessary for truth evaluability. So you have to provide something, and there won't be any context in which it would be okay not to provide anything. So we can use in our representation of the meaning the free variable that triggers the contextual process of saturation. So saturation is a pragmatic process because it's something that takes place in context, but it's linguistically controlled or linguistically triggered by something in the linguistic material. Well, in the case of modulation, that's not the case. Modulation is also a pragmatic process, something that takes place in context, but it's not linguistically triggered or controlled. It's entirely contextual. It's pragmatically controlled. There's nothing in the linguistic material itself that requires modulation to take place. You modulate the meaning just because it's more appropriate in the context. Even you use the word that's close to what you have in mind. It's not perfectly appropriate, but it's understood with an approximate meaning that sort of more or less fits the situation. And what's important about modulation in contrast to saturation is that modulation is something that's universal. You can always modulate the meaning of the expressions you use. It's not a property of a specific class of expressions in contrast to saturation. Saturation is supposed to work for a class of expression, namely the indexicals on the other context-sensitive expression. It's a particular class of expression whose meaning is incomplete and which trigger a contextual process of saturation. But modulation is something that can always happen. It doesn't depend on which expression you use. Okay. And here a slide about why modulation is important. Well, I think that the reason that we do modulate the meaning of our words is that we use always the same words. We have a finite stock of words to talk about an indefinite variety of situations, things, and so on. So we use the same words, but the situations change, but we use the same words. So we've got to adjust the meaning of the expression to the situations. And of course, that's easy to do because when I talk to someone, the person knows the situation I'm talking about and is able to understand how we should interpret a particular expression in that context. We have to modulate to adjust the meaning to the particulars of the situation at stake. So there is this very nice quotation from Bollinger. Since the universe never repeats itself exactly, every time we speak, we metaphorize. That's the idea that whenever we use words each time with a slightly different meaning because the situation is always new. And so there are always slight nuances. It's not, even though the standing meaning of words is always the same, it's constant throughout the language, we keep modulating the meaning, and that gives us different occasion meanings in different contexts. That's the idea. So I think that if semantic interaction is to be accounted for by appealing to contextual processes, as per the second theory, the contextual theory, there is no reason to restrict the type of contextual process at issue to saturation. We need to accept that modulation too plays a role in the determination of occasion meaning. Just as a value contextually assigned to an indexical may be influenced by the linguistic context, the modulated value of a given expression that a given expression takes in context may also be influenced by the linguistic environment. So the phenomenon of semantic interaction can be thought to involve modulation. Now, let's go back to this issue about compositionality. Is modulation compatible with compositionality? So that's a sort of tricky issue. There is a sense in which we are tempted to answer yes. And that's the following sense. So take a case like if we accept that there is modulation, that modulation affects what is said, or something like this. Then we have to accept that if you take a sentence, like cut the grass, as an imperative, and we fix the standing meanings of all the expressions in the sentence, so that will determine, the compositional rules of the language will determine the literal meaning of the sentence, compositionally. But the thing you mean, the thing you say by using the sentence, can still vary more or less indefinitely because you can still modulate the expressions more or less the way you like. So that means that what you actually communicate, what you say using the sentence, isn't determined compositionally by the standing meanings of the constituents and the way they're put together. There's something additional that takes place, and that's modulation. And modulation means that the same sentence with the same meaning for all expressions, in the same context possibly, but with different intentions ascribed to the speaker, might end up saying different things. So that seems to be a sort of an argument against compositionality, and that's the sort of argument that certain contextualists might make. But I think that we should stick to this distinction. I said that the important distinction between standing meaning and occasion meaning, and that if we are faithful to the distinction, we'll see that actually there is compatibility between the phenomenon I've talked about, semantic interaction, understood as involving modulation, possibly in certain cases, on the one hand, and compositionality. So we have these two levels. We have the standing meaning, and we have the literal meaning, and we have the occasion meaning, which in part results from modulation. Now, I want to say that the literal meaning is compositional in the sense that the literal meaning of a sentence is a function of the literal meanings of the constituent, immediate constituents, and to the bottom, and the way the constituents are put together. So that's okay, and that's something that is easily acceptable. The problem is with the modulated meaning. The modulated meaning seems to go beyond what's determined compositionality by the rules of the language. That was the problem, the reason why there was some kind of incompatibility when we consider the modulated meaning. But I think that we can actually maintain that the modulated meaning itself proceeds compositionally in a certain way. So we can have some form of compositionality both for the standing meaning and for the modulated meaning. So here's what I mean. We might say that instead, you remember when I started with those rules, the composition rules, that's the first slide, so. Yes, I said that the composition rules determine the meaning of a complex expression on the basis of the meaning of the constituents on the word under syntactic organization. And the rule has the form, the interpretation I of a complex expression, alpha, beta in a certain syntactic organization, is a certain function which depends upon precisely the syntactic organization of this complex expression, is a function of the interpretation of the constituent expression alpha and the interpretation of the constituent expression beta. So we determine the meaning of the complex on the basis of the meaning of the simple expressions. And I suggest a sort of modification of this schema to take account of modulation. So what I suggest is the following modification. Sorry, it's farther than I thought. Yes, here we are. I suggest that the interpretation of a complex expression should be thought as a function, so far nothing has changed, but a function not of the literal meaning of the expression alpha, the constituent expression, and the literal meaning of the expression beta, but rather a function of the modulated meaning of alpha and the modulated meaning of beta. That is, you take the literal meaning of alpha, the literal meaning or standing meaning of beta, you subject them to modulation, to optional modulation in context. So it might be the cases of zero modulation in which nothing happens, cases in which you speak literally, but you have to make room for the possibility of modulation. So the building blocks out of which you make the meaning of the complex expression is actually not the literal meanings of the constituents, but rather the modulated meanings of the constituents. That is that whenever you put together the meaning of two expressions to make up the meaning of a complex expression, you are allowed to modulate the meanings of the constituents which you put together. So on this view, each time you construct the meaning of a complex expression, you make room or allow for a modulation of the meanings of your building blocks. And in this case, you can have a sort of a compositional picture of the process of the determination of the meaning of the complex expression, even though that interpretation includes or incorporates the results of modulation. So I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. It's again extremely interesting here. I have only one modest question. I do hold this question relevant. I'm not quite certain. And then I wonder, how would you approach the following examples? Just to be quite frank, but not examples that I invented. I take examples from famous Polish philosopher Kazimierz Twardowski, his excellent paper by him published in the 1920s or so. And namely, the examples are followed. I will start the simplest one. We say car, and we say blue car. So that is clear that we mean car that has a certain property. Every blue car is a car, not every car is a blue car. On the other hand, we may say true friend. That's not the same as with blue car, because it is not so that we have friends, and some of them are true friends, the true friends. The third example is false friend. False friend is not a friend at all. So I wonder whether your modulation theory can explain those examples. I don't think that is a pragmatic phenomenon. I rather think that is purely semantic. But I'm not quite certain.
Yes, well, the issue of the border of semantics and pragmatics is always problematic. Right, so true friend, I'm not sure exactly what the right story should be, but you said something about false friend. You said a false friend is not a friend, and I think that's right. So that's something that I haven't talked about, but that corresponds to one particular case of interaction. That's the case when you have false friend. It seems that here, because of the adjective false, the meaning of friend must be modulated. I would say it is a case of modulation. Yes, yes. So in the cases that I talked about, there is the adjective and the noun, and we have to modulate the adjective depending on the noun, basically, to modulate or perhaps to saturate, depending on, so that has to be seen. But in cases of privative adjectives, like say a fake dollar, you have a dollar, that's a dollar means dollar, but if you say a fake dollar is not a dollar, and what that means is that in the complex phrase fake dollar, because of the word fake, the meaning of dollar is, I would think, modulated. Now, how modulated? I think this is similar to this notion of broadening. Like when I say crazy can be used to mean not literally crazy, but something who behaves like as a crazy person would. So that's a case of in which the extension, there is a sort of enlargement. We include more in the extension than normally if we take the literal sense of crazy. That's a set of crazy people. But when we use crazy in this extended sense, we have also people who are not really crazy but behave like the crazy people. So it's a larger set. So the extension is, so we have, well, anyway. So I think that something similar happens. So that is, normally a dollar is what it is. We know what it is, a banknote and so on. We know. And there is an extended sense in which a dollar includes the category of dollar, the concept of dollar, or includes things that are not really dollars, but look like dollars, or something of the sort. That is, we enlarge the notion, we broaden the notion, and I think that one argument for saying that that's what's happening when we say fake dollar, a fake dollar is a dollar in the enlarged sense. It's something that looks like a dollar, but that's a fake. That's not a genuine one. So we have the category of dollar in the extended sense that includes both the fake ones and the genuine ones. Well, normally when we use the word dollar, we mean the genuine one. Now, an argument in favor of this analysis is that it's possible, as Barbara Party noticed, to show a dollar and say, is this dollar a fake one or a genuine one? And here it seems that I'm using dollar when I say is this dollar. It seems that I'm using dollar in this extended sense, in the sense of prima facie dollar. And then if it's prima facie dollar, that means that there is this category of prima facie dollar that includes both the fake and the genuine ones. And that means basically that the people who've talked about adjective non-combinations, they generally say that there is the normal case which is intersective, and there are the cases that are not intersective, like the case of a privative adjective and so on, or all the cases that I talked about. But there is another way of looking at the situation by saying that it's always intersective, except that we have modulation. So the contribution of the word dollar and fake dollar is not the ordinary concept of dollar. It's an enlarged concept, which means something like prima facie dollar. And then a fake dollar is a dollar, a prima facie dollar that happens to be fake. And it's sort of an intersective. In the same way, you might say that the big mouse, well, anyway, let's forget about big mouse. Yes, so I think that I would go that direction to suggest that those cases are actually amenable to that sort of treatment. Now, when you say it's semantic, yes, there is I'm pretty sure there is a sense in which this is semantic. This has to do with the semantics of words like fake. Fake trigger this interpretation, this modulation of the complement. So that's interesting. I don't know, because I said that modulation is not mandatory, but it may be that in certain contexts there is some kind of coercion. Now look at the example that you have here in this slide, which I forgot. That was my last slide. I forgot to give it. You have other examples in which, very similar. So take pretty straight. So straight means something. Straight means straight. That's something absolute. You're straight or you're not straight, basically. When you say pretty straight, that's very strange because you have this degree adjective here. But something that's straight is straight or not straight, pretty cannot apply to this predicate straight in the literal sense. But it's a bit like fake dollar. Here, because you're using this modifier pretty, that induces a modulation of straight. And straight here doesn't mean straight in the literal absolute sense. It means something that approximates straightness. And that's something that can be modified because something can approximate straightness to a greater or lesser degree. Or take a different example. Suppose you said of someone, he's very French. French means French. You're French or you're not French. You're not very French. But if you say very French, precisely because you say very and you introduce this gradation, that induces or that triggers a sort of modulation of the meaning of French, which now doesn't mean French anymore. It means something like a French or typical Frenchness or something like this, which is. So I think that's the same sort of phenomenon that we have. We have cases in which, given the modifier, we have to modulate the meaning of the noun, and that's different from the cases I talked about in the talk.
Can I have a follow-up?
What
is this? There is this competitive story about what you are talking. It's called, I think, modular completion. I think van der Wecken is one of the proponents. The idea is that, well, if you use a word like fake, you basically intend to refer to a sort of completion of the set of dollars. But it's not a regular completion, the set theoretical sense, but well, somehow in the meaning of fake. Yeah, it's not to be found among elephants or whatever. It's just something that looks like coins. Yeah, so and that applies to things like pretty straight. Yeah, it's a kind of completion, but well, not regular completion. It produces a set of somewhat not so straight things. So what's wrong with the Van der Becken modular?
I don't know. I would have to look into to see. I don't know where is it in which. Yeah, but you don't remember where in particular. No, I didn't know that actually. I should look at that suggestion. I would also apply the same notions to an example like stone lion. So when you talk about a stone lion, you might say also a stone lion is not a lion. It's a statue, it's not a lion, not a real lion. But I think that here as well we understand lion presumably in a broader sense. That includes not only the organic lions, the real lions, but also the things that look like lions and something like this. And when you have the modifier stone, of course, that cannot be a real organic lion. So we've got to understand it in that sort of way. I don't know whether Van der Becken's notion would work as well for this case.
I had just a clarification question about modulation of more complex structures, such as 7 sentences. For instance, this example discussed with the literature visiting relatives can be annoying. So would you say that there is a default meaning of the sentence, or is it simply ambiguous? And then if it is ambiguous, so is it a kind of modulation, so a pragmatic process made by pragmatics, or more like something that is linguistically triggered, that is the ambiguity is at the linguistic level than modulated by pragmatics. So if I'm question about the border between modulation and
so in this case, I would say yes. This is a straightforward ambiguity. So there are these different structures. So this is clearly linguistic. Of course, the process of disambiguation, that is understanding the sentence in context, finding out which is the right interpretation, that's something that's pragmatic, just like the other things that I'm talking about. But the basis and the trigger, as it were, there's something that there are these two linguistic structures. But the border issue is more relevant when we're not thinking of ambiguity proper, like in this case, especially structural ambiguity, but rather ambiguity at the lexical level, because there is the phenomenon of polysemy. In polysemy, words have different meanings. It's a matter of convention. It's in the language. It's something you find in dictionaries. But the meanings, when we talk of a polysemous expression, we mean that the meaning of the expression are not, it's not just a brute fact, there is a sort of a family resemblance, there is some connection between the different meanings. And what does that mean? And those connections are supposed to be alive in the consciousness, in the awareness of the language users, that is there. And what is this matter of connections that makes the difference between polysemy and ambiguity? I think that it's very much like modulation. When you have a certain meaning for an expression, you can generate other meanings by modulating in different directions using semantic transfer, enrichment, and loosening, that sort of thing. And that's actually what we keep doing. And when it becomes conventional, because we keep using an expression that way, the sense, the modulated sense becomes conventional. But it becomes conventional, there is a stage at which the modulated sense is conventional, but we're still perfectly aware that it's a modulation of another sense, that there are this relation between the senses. So that's how I would understand polysemy. So it's both the pragmatic, it's both modulation, something pragmatic, and we're conscious of that, more or less. But at the same time, it's already in the semantics, it's already conventional in the language. So it's something intermediate in that case.
Jolanta? Okay, this may be a bit unfair because it doesn't concern your own view, but I'm just wondering, you divide primary pragmatic processes into saturation and modulation, but for instance, Emma Borg, she says that 3 pragmatic processes can be divided into modulation and unarticulated constituents. And I'm just wondering, if you have a view, you don't believe in unarticulated constituents in the context, but if someone does, in the content, if someone does and wants to have both modulation and unarticulated constituent as a separate sort of, phenomenon, like location in weather sentences, do you think it's still possible to retain compositionality, or unarticulated constituents would make it?
Yeah, that's an interesting issue. So first, I think that, so unarticulated, so modulation, indeed, the difference between modulation and unarticulated constituents, unarticulated constituents is very much like enrichment, that is, you add something contextual because of the context, you add some element to the meaning. For example, you go from stop to stop in this particular manner. The particular manner is something that comes from the context. It's not, has nothing to do with the lexical meaning, but it comes from the context. It comes from the context, but because it's modulation, you start from the meaning of stop, the lexical meaning, and that's what you enrich. And that means that the meaning, the enriched meaning stop in this or that manner, this is still the occasional meaning of this expression stop. Now, unarticulated constituents are supposed to be ingredients of the overall meaning of what you say that do not correspond to any particular word in the sentence. It's something more holistic. And so I don't know what a convincing example would be. Often when you say it's snowing or it's raining, you're supposed to mean it's raining at such and such a place. But some people think that here the at such and such a place is not really a modulation of the meaning of rain, though it might be, why not? But they want to say that no, it's possible to have an ingredient of the meaning that doesn't correspond to any particular expression. That's something more global. So maybe there might be better examples. But suppose that we want to say that that exists. Then I think we could reduce that to a case of modulation at the topmost level. So basically, as I describe things with the previous slide, whenever we put together two expressions in a complex, and we want to determine the meaning of the complex, we are allowed in the process of composing the meanings of the parts together to get the meaning of the complex, we are allowed to modulate the meanings of the parts in so doing. That's the idea that modulation and composition proceed in tandem. So we put alpha and beta together, we modulate the meaning of alpha and beta, and that gives us the meaning alpha beta. And we do that until we reach the level of the complete sentence. And the meaning of the complete sentence on this view depends upon the meaning of the constituents, given that the meanings of the constituent may include some kind of modulation. Now, it might be that you can also, when you reach that stage, the meaning of the whole that's determined by the modulated meanings of the parts, you get something, and then you might modulate what you get. And that would be something like adding something that cannot be traced, indeed, to any of the constituents, but it would be modulation at the topmost level. And that would correspond, theoretically, to this idea of an articulated constituent. Now, what's interesting is that I said that this is compositional because the meaning of the complex, the pre-topmost modulation meaning of the complex is determined by the modulated meanings of the parts. But this extra modulation, it would come in addition, and that would be a sort of I think, possibly violation of compositionality. So one way one possibility for someone who accepts that such things exist and someone who wants to retain the idea of the compositionality of content would be to say that this extra modulation at the topmost level would be something like a conversational implicature that wouldn't be part of the content. So that would be, so this is a tool that you can always use. There is always this distinction between the content, what you say, and things which you don't say, but you sort of imply. So this is a different phenomenon. And modulation, like saturation, is supposed to contribute to the content proper. And I'm saying this can be done compositionally, but there might be extra ingredients of meaning that are not compositional, but they might perhaps be considered as not part of content either. But it's all open. I'm not even sure that the phenomenon exists. Actually, yes, there is yes, I now remember, there is a paper by the new Jonathan Cohen and Andrew Keller, a paper called, which is unpublished as yet, called Conversational Elicitor. So it's a new phenomenon. People keep coining new words. After Rice's implicature, there was impliciter by Ken Back, and now there is elicitor. And there's another guy who was Elskulpatcher, or there are plenty. But anyway, that's a phenomenon that he talks about in that paper that I think looks very much like something like this topmost modulation, a phenomenon that looks like modulation but can't be reduced to any constituent in the sentence. So maybe that could be an example. Yeah. So this is very much open issue, and sort of, I don't know.
Szymon, Roman, Michał.
Okay, so that might be not a good question, but still I want to ask, would it be possible to apply this notion of modulation to proper names? In the cases of, for example, someone says there are 2 Picassos in this museum, so in the, we might say that the proper name isn't referential in that case, but it somehow modulates and it becomes a predicate or something like that. Would it be possible to apply it?
I think yes, but the problem with this particular example is that we change the category. We're using Picasso as a common noun. We're using it in the plural, and this is so this goes together with a shift in the meaning, which is very much like a phenomenon of modulation. But this is really triggered by this formal feature. It's a bit like when you gave the example of rabbit that we can use as a mass term. But rabbit is a count noun. There is a rabbit in the garden, and there is rabbit in my plate. So you're now using rabbit as a mass term, and that induces a semantic shift, a shift in the meaning. So that when I talk about modulation, I'm not talking about those shifts that are induced by sort of a formal operation at the morphosyntactic level. I'm not talking about that, even though this is similar. But I guess that for names, we could find presumably examples that would be more like modulation because there wouldn't be any such formal operation like the passage from say, count noun to mass noun or in this case, to proper name to common noun. So we can certainly use a name with a modulated meaning. Not too sure. I mean, I've got some examples, but I'm not sure they were. So in principle, yes, I'm pretty sure that we can have that sort of thing with proper names. But it's hard to go further because that also depends on one's semantics for proper names, how one treat them, and that's very controversial too. So it's sort of hard. But in principle, why not? Except that this example involves this formal operation, so it's a bit different.
I think that a good model for analyzing what is compositionality is what mathematicians do, because if you remember my remark from yesterday, again I want to say that the idea of compositionality and the idea that in natural languages it also applies, it comes from that paradigm of analysis of language that comes from mathematical language. And from that point of view, most of your examples are bad examples, because most of your examples are examples that may happen in mathematical language. And only a few of your examples, as I think, are good examples because they use metaphors or such situations, generally such situations when you modulate the meaning of the word by something like similarity or loose association. This is your case example with rabbit, which may be on your neck or on your plate, and with a machine that swallowed some money, and the case with the crazy man, let's say. These examples, they apply such manipulations on language that mathematicians wouldn't do. The rest, and even the case with cutting grass, I would say they would somehow explain this. And if you analyze mathematical language, it seems sometimes strange that they speak very strictly, but in different contexts, they use almost similar vocabulary. For example, they add numbers and add sets, for example. Use the same word add, and even the same symbols they use. but in different contexts. And even in the same context, for example, a letter which is written before a bracket may be a symbol of a function, but what is inside the bracket is not a function. It even may be the same letter, but in different positions in one formula. And this is what mathematicians do. And so this is my comment that I wanted to do. The second, my comment is that what you said when you answered to Joanna, you make a difference between what is what I would say the final content, what is said within the given act of communication, and the content which is not perhaps final, but the actual content of the utterance. And I would say if the idea of the final content is understandable somehow, so I would say that the idea of the actual or real content of an utterance, which would be somewhere in the middle between literal understanding and the final content, seems suspicious, I would say, and finally I would say it's impossible to defend, because I don't know how we would like to define it.
So in this particular case that we were talking about, I don't know, I mentioned an article in which there is a certain phenomenon that might be handled that way. It might be that indeed this treatment by dividing the content into these two parts wouldn't be very plausible in that case, I don't know. But for ordinary cases, there is this notion of conversational implicature that's used as in contrast to the content proper. But the content proper is something that's already pragmatically rich, that depends upon all sorts of contextual processes. And someone like you might say, this thing in the middle that corresponds to the content, that's pragmatic, but that falls short of being the complete content because there are the implicatures that come in addition. This is something that can't work. There is no motivation for this stopping point. We must go to the final content, that's it, or we stay with the literal meaning of the words in the language, but there is no stopping point in the middle, someone might say. And I understand that worry very well. But I think that the one reason to actually accept something like this distinction between the pragmatically rich content of what is said and the full content that includes also the implicatures is that it's actually reflected in the phenomenology, in our intuitions about meaning. So I think that's part of the phenomenon. I think that when someone says something, we are aware that the person has said something and that by saying that he has implied something else. We are fully aware of that, just like we're aware of the difference between what we see and what we can infer from what we see. So I think that there are good grounds for saying that there is one such distinction that is operative in our understanding of language, that's reflected in our truth traditional intuitions and so on and so forth. Now, I agree with you that there should be, one shouldn't simply use such a distinction in an ad hoc manner just to solve problems. One should have good grounds for drawing the distinction, like what I just mentioned, are precisely the grounds that we have. We have intuitive grounds for drawing such distinction. I'm not sure that that could be done in the case that I was discussing with Joanna. So I understand this sort of skepticism. Now,
say a word here. In the case with cutting the grass, so one would say that, of course, there's lots of ways you can cut the grass. There are two ways were presented. But when I say to someone, when I say the order, cut the grass, one might say, this is not the question that the meaning of cut is modulated, but this is modulated and the doer interprets it upon the modulation, which kind of cutting he is to apply. But simply, the way of cutting is something that I haven't said. Right. It's not within the content, I would say. And to make my case more precise, I could do the same, have the same effect, saying, for example, do it. And even I could say the same effect, saying, yeah, in a given context, you would understand his
Yeah, but when you say do it, you use the pronoun it. You don't make fully explicit what it is that you're talking about, but it may be clear in context that it is a certain action that we've been talking before.
But you know, but what would you like to say? Do it and cut the grass, have the same.
No. My point simply is that in the case of do it, we all accept that there is something that's contributed by context, which is the reference of it. But despite the fact that it's contributed by context, it's not made explicit by the words themselves. I didn't say what it was that you were supposed to do. I say it because that was salient enough. In the same way, I think that when something is not said, like the manner of cutting, even if it's not said explicitly, and we cannot be totally explicit anyway, so even if it's not said explicitly, it can be perfectly clear in context. So if I order someone to cut the grass, for example, and the person, as in the Sol example, stabs it with a knife, I would consider that my order has not been obeyed, because even though that was not fully explicit, the manner of cutting was not made fully explicit, still it was perfectly obvious in the context. And when something is perfectly obvious in the context, that can contribute to the content in the rich, pragmatic rich sense, in which there are certain things that come from the context, but provided that this is mutually understood by the participants and by anyone who actually is a witness to the conversation, that's enough to consider that it's part of the content. So it's this intermediate notion of content. It's pragmatically rich. It includes elements that are not explicitly said, but still it falls short of including also the implicatures for reasons that I again could not go into. But I haven't. And I haven't responded to your first thing about mathematics. So basically what you said suggests that even though there is this big difference between, say, the language of science or mathematics and ordinary language that has all those properties that I mentioned, you suggested actually that even in mathematics we do those things, there is modulation takes place and so on, and I think, yes, that's probably right. Now, you started by saying that compositionality is more something that works with formal languages. It's not something like what we have in natural language. I oppose this view by actually, that's exactly what Jonathan Cohen says. He thinks that because these phenomena are so important, they should be the basis of our understanding how language works. So he thought really that the theory of metaphor should come first. That's what he thought, actually. And we should build our semantics upon that. Once we have a theory, proper theory of metaphor, then we should do semantics for natural language. And, but that's not, so what I said is quite opposed to that. I said basically that there are those phenomena that are very important, but there is also this compositionality thing, and they're compatible. We should have all those things together. It's not that we must have one rather than the other. That was my point.
Yeah, so it may seem such a long answer that is only like a follow-up question, sort of. Because I was wondering whether we can, because you said we cannot be totally explicit anyway.
Yes.
And I kind of agree with that. And my question is, what are the borders, what are the borderlines for modulation? Because you said that some semantic content is represented explicitly more or less in the sentence. And this is where when modulation does not happen. So optionality of modulation triggers with something extra. And I was wondering what this extra is, and we define it. So is each metaphor modulation, or is it actually like this that each pragmatic utterance is a modulation? Isn't it the same mechanism?
So yeah, I don't follow. So there is this issue of so basically the idea that we can be fully literal, that means that there will be aspects of what we say or mean that will not be made fully explicit. And the reason why we can't be fully explicit is that if we make that certain aspect fully explicit, so take the sentence, he took out his key and opened the door. You have two conjunctions, you say that the person took out his key, and you say that he opened the door, and we naturally understand that he opened the door with the key. But that was not said. That was implicit, but we naturally understand it that way. If we make it explicit by saying he opened the door with the key, making explicit this element that was implicit, then we introduce new elements that are implicit. That is, how did he use the key? Did he put it in the keyhole, or did he use it as an axe to break the door open? There are all sorts of new possibilities. Each time you say something explicit, each time you introduce new elements that are not explicit, but that serve as a background for understanding what is explicit. So the explicit and the implicit, they sort of go in tandem. Each time you make something implicit, you introduce some new implicit elements, so that's why you can get rid of the implicit elements, I think. Now, your question seems to bear on the difference between the case in which we speak literally and the case in which we modulate.
To be more precise, however, isn't it always like this, that we modulate when we speak? Isn't it each our utterance actually modulates?
It's quite possible that in every utterance there is an element of modulation. It's quite possible, but certainly if we focus on a particular expression, like stop, cut, or whatever, any word, it's possible also to use the expression in a purely literal sense, I think. That's possible. That's always possible. So precisely because modulation is optional. So it's not like with the case of saturation, in which a given expression, when you use it, you must do something like saturate the variable. In the case of modulation, something you may do or you may not do. That doesn't mean that what I just said about particular expression is compatible with the fact that in every utterance there must be some modulation or other, which is what you're suggesting, perhaps.
Yeah, I was wondering whether it's optional or necessary for natural language to be modulated. Because if it's necessary, then is it like sort of criteria from formal languages? What's the base of modulation then if it describes every sentence in our language?
Well, actually, it's yeah. Okay, so in my response, I distinguish between necessary with respect to a particular expression or in general. But suppose that, so I assume in this talk that expressions have standing meanings, that there is a dictionary that assigns meanings, literal meanings to expressions, and that we can modulate that optionally. But some people would say, and that might be right, that there is no such thing as the literal meaning of an expression. The only thing there is this an expression, and the only thing there is a great number of uses, more or less conventional uses of that expression. It's a sort of a vast array, out of which every time you use the expression, you must somehow use this vast array of uses as a sort of background out of which you use as to extract from it what you mean in this context. So if you have that sort of view, and there is no literal meaning in the traditional sense, then you might say that something like modulation is, as it were, necessary. But if you say that, then of course, you cannot help yourself anymore to the contrast between saturation and modulation. But that's an interesting avenue of research, because it all depends on what we take the literal meaning of expressions to be, and it may be that there is no such thing really. But people who work on deep learning and the way they represent the meaning of words, really it's the bit vectors, and it's really a collection of uses, very, very large collection of uses, and that's the meaning, and there is nothing else. So if that's right, then perhaps modulation is necessary, not optional, in which case we shouldn't maybe talk of modulation, because the way I define it, it's got to be optional.
So I have a question a bit connected with your response to Michał. Would you be so kind and show us the slide with the solution and your formula?
Sorry. Oh, it's the end.
It's at the end.
It's at the end.
Oh, yeah.
Yes, there it was.
Yeah, right. So I find it a little bit confusing that you use the predicate, the formal I that stands for like interpretation or meaning or the standard meaning, both with the complex formula and with the singular, so to say, formulas. And I wonder if it's like exactly the same thing. Do you mean like with alpha and beta, like literal meaning of some term that you can look up in a dictionary? Because if so, then there are no literal meanings of complex terms or sentences that you can look up in dictionary. So isn't it? So that's my question. If it's exactly the same thing on both sides.
No, you're right. I started with this distinction between what I call lexical rules and composition rules. So in the case of simple, well, actually this may be a complex expression already because that's only a constituent, but let's assume this is atomic. Then for the atomic case, we have this lexical rule that assigns a meaning to an expression saying the interpretation of beta is M. But we can still use a sort of and that's different from the case in which we have complex expression, and then the meaning of the complex expression is something that's determined, it's more complex how to get to this. It's not directly given. But we can still talk about the meaning of the interpretation while distinguishing these two cases. So the meaning of an expression, depending if it's a simple expression that will be directly given in the dictionary, if it's a complex expression that will be computed because that will be compositional and we'll have such a formula, but we can still use this notion of the meaning of the expression or the interpretation of an expression, even though it comes down to different things in different cases. So that was my idea.
My question also concerns this formula, and it's just a clarificatory question. Why don't we need another G in front of F? That is, isn't it the case that the way in which we combine those modulated meanings will also depend on the context? Like the example you gave with the policeman stopped the car, right? And then we say, and something happened. And obviously, the meaning of and will depend on how we understand the stopping, in what way we stopped it, maybe and then, and as a result. And
yeah, but so stop might be beta, and then we have the interpretation of beta, which is the sort of literal meaning of stop, and we modulate stop in a certain manner, so that would go into the content of the conjunct stop the car, and then we can use this to compute the meaning of the overall conjunctive sentence. But your question about whether we should have a G here, I think we can. But so the suggestion here with this sort of a hybrid picture with a bit of compositionality and a bit of modulation, the idea is that we modulate when we compose. So when we have expressions which we put together to determine the meaning of more complex expression, each time we do that, we are allowed to modulate the meanings of the building blocks we use. That gives us a result, which is the semantic content of the complex expression. That complex expression itself can be composed, the meaning of that expression, with some other elements in a bigger sentence. And if we do that, then we modulate that content we get as a result of the previous process. We can modulate it again in constructing the meaning of more complex expressions. So we would indeed introduce this new G in front of this if this complex expression now is composed with some other elements in a bigger phrase. Then this thing will itself be modulated. There will be a further G, which is equivalent to putting the G here, because that's the content that we would modulate to. And then there is the further issue of this topmost modulation, which it would be modulation that takes place, but not in the process of composition, of putting together building blocks. That would be something extra.
Roman?
I wanted to get back to your talk from yesterday. You talked also about false descriptions, as in Donovan's famous case with the man drinking martini. And in such cases, whole long phrases give an amount of meaning which finally, as you said yesterday, don't get into the proposition. And to a degree, I understand that you mean the content, that you will talk about today, is something like the proposition. So it would be that the result would be that all these words that are in the phrase "the man drinking martini," their meaning is entirely lost for the composition of the proposition.
Lost because we go to the object that's the target.
Yes, because you would say literal meaning is not. You cannot say, I understand, that this is the modulation of meaning of this word, that we take a man that is not drinking a martini as the result.
That would be a theoretical possibility.
Yes, but we use the phrase to resolve the demand. So the meaning of this word is leather, but you throw it away. So in that part of the sentence, whatever you say about that man drinking martini, the compositionality doesn't work at all, I understand, because meaning of this word is thrown away.
I'm not sure exactly what you have in mind, but the case in which the meaning of the words don't end up in the proposition, it's not only the case in which you use its description referentially, so you use the expression as a tool that will help you determine which object is being talked about, and then the proposition is a singular proposition about that object. And the model here is the indexicals. In the case of the indexicals, the indexical has a certain meaning, say I, you, and so on, mean something, but the content you evaluate is supposed to be a singular proposition about the reference. So there are aspects of the meaning that give you an object. So yeah, there is this character-content distinction that we can use. And so it's sort of an issue that's orthogonal to stuff about compositionality because, yeah, but maybe I haven't thought about the relation between these two issues. But the fact that you have this distinction between character and content is not generally taken to be sort of anything non-compositional, but though, well, yeah, I don't know actually. This has to be explored. Yeah.
That observation makes me myself thinking that if there is any compositionality in natural languages, so this is restricted to very special situations of building a proposition from the final elements that build them. But the way from the words in the sentence to the final propositional set is very long. So finally you cannot talk about compositionality almost at all. That's, but you know, the basis for my result is just thinking about such cases like lost meaning of the expression, the man drinking martini, but you have analyzed that, I see. Okay, may I go on? Because I wanted to say something to the question that you...
Yes, go ahead. I'm waiting for
That's what I wanted to ask add to the previous question was, in the case when somebody orders cutting the grass, would you, and the doer understands exactly what he is to do, would you say that the following utterances have the same content? Go, one, the second, do it, the third, cut the grass. Do they have the same content if the result is the same?
I would think not.
But and if not, why?
Maybe do it and cut the grass, yes. Might be that they end up being the same content.
Go.
But not the go no. But anyway.
Okay. So I have maybe a clarification question about this formula. I'm wondering if this left part could be modulated further, not being assumed of G1 and G2. So for example, let's start from alpha and beta. So for example, this is an example. I drove the car drunk. So let's say the car is alpha and beta is drunk. So I can mean that I'm driving my car being drunk, and being drunk I can modulate accordingly to be drunk for driving, for example, etc., etc. Or it can mean that I'm driving a toy car. Okay, so I'm in a competition, I'm driving a toy car, I'm being drunk and completely drunk. So, okay, but what if the result, I'm driving the car drunk, could be modulated further? I mean, from the broader context, it could be known that I'm driving the car drunk as an actor, acting or something. Is it a violation of compositionality, or it can be this meaning can be received?
So there is no doubt that we can do that. That's a good example. You can use the sentence, I drove the car drunk in one of those modulated senses, and in addition, meaning that you did that in a certain film as an actor and so on. So I don't know exactly what your point is. Your point is presumably that this extra modulation as an actor is not something that's, again, this stuff about whether all modulation is driven by the compositional process, that we modulate as we compose. Here it doesn't seem that it's the case because it's the same sentence, I drove the car drunk, that can be interpreted with this sort of internal modulation of car and drunk that you described, but also in addition with a further modulation, meaning that it's not something you did in reality, but only in acting. And that doesn't seem to correspond to any new composition process or any bigger sentence or anything like that. And if that's the case, that would be in the same ballpark as this topmost modulation. That would be an extra modulation that takes place when you have your content resulting from the modulation of the parts and the compositional process. You get something and then you do some further modulation. That would be one option. And the other option is to perhaps, well, I guess there would be several options, like things that I haven't talked about, like the fact that when you speak, you refer to certain situations, and what you say is a way of characterizing situations to which you refer. Here I've only talked about the content, which is the characterization you provide. I haven't said anything about the fact that when you speak, you talk about this situation or that situation. So it might be that the same sentence with the same modulated content in this case could be used to talk about what you did in reality or what you did in the film, which would be two different situations. So that would be another source of context sensitivity, which I haven't talked about at all. So that need not be topmost modulation. There are other resources, but I'm not sure. That's a great example, but I'm not sure exactly what to do with it. But that's good, yeah.
Okay. Joanna?
Some of your examples involved comparative words like big or good, and it seems to me that these cases are closer to saturation than to modulation, because in order to determine true value of a sentence which contains these words, we need to provide a reference class, and without this class we have no idea whether this sentence is true or false, whereas in other cases the abstract meaning is enough to evaluate the true value of a sentence. If we use the word cut in this abstract sense, then cutting grass with a knife also counts as cutting, so we can say that in such a situation indeed a man cut a grass, whereas in case of big, without this reference class, we cannot say whether something is really.
I fully agree, and I agree with everything you said. So indeed, there are cases in which looks more like saturation because it's mandatory. We can't imagine a context in which we would not provide the relevant element that seems to be really semantically required. So that's cases of saturation, and I think that cases like big or possibly good also are in this category. If we look at those cases here, maybe it's not the case for all the examples. For example, in the case of pink, I'm not sure that when you say something that it is pink, that you need to provide, that it's mandatory to provide the dimension or the part of the object that has the color. I'm not sure that it's something that's mandatory. I have an example like imagine a red surface. I think that in this case, not clear to me that there is anything missing. Well, so I think that you're right for big and words that require something like a comparison class as a matter of semantics. And presumably fast, there is I guess it probably works for them as well. But for light is a case of polysemy, I would say. It's a bit different. So it looks like modulation, but it's sort of a conventionalized. And in case like color adjectives, it's really very controversial what to say. I'm not sure at all that it's a matter of saturation there. I think it's more a matter of modulation. But I agree with the point and the examples you guys, yeah.
Okay. If there are no questions, I will have a very clarification question, very detailed question on slide 40 that from Nagranie.
Again, okay.
So you say that G1, or you write here that G are variables ranging over available pragmatic functions, which means that G1 and G2 could be different functions.
Yes.
But okay, but is it always one function, or is it unimportant? Because it suggests that either saturation or modulation or free enrichment or whatever. It's one of them.
Sorry. So there is this issue: one function, several functions, and here clearly there are several functions. Because there are all sorts of functions that.
Yes, but for a particular case, you have the modulation of I of alpha. So G1 is just either saturation or modulation or.
Oh, I see. No. That's the G's are supposed to be modulation functions. So I'm not. Yeah. So here there's no representation of saturation. Indeed, that's not very general. It's a kind of modulation. The free enrichment versus transfer versus broadening. Yeah, well, actually, they are different. So there would be different different modulation functions. So, for example, I had this example: the city is asleep that I mentioned. I didn't say anything about it. Don't know. Yeah, here it is. In this case, you have to. So, city means city. Asleep means asleep. There is no need for saturation. There is no free variable. No incompleteness. The words mean what they mean. But when you put together in the sentence city and asleep, you have a problem because there is sort of type mismatch. And you need to do something. What you do is you modulate. You need to modulate. It's sort of coercion. And you can either modulate asleep or modulate city. So those would be examples in which you would have modulation function. So for example, if you understand city to mean the inhabitants of the city, so you go from the city to its inhabitants, that would be one modulation function. You could also go from a city to anything. That would be another one. So it's something very specific. A particular interpretation corresponds to a particular modulation function. It's not something general like free enrichment. That would be too broad. And similarly for asleep, you can keep the literal meaning of city and take asleep to mean not really asleep, but broadening this, meaning something like quiet and showing little activity as sleeping people do. And then that would be another very specific modulation function. That's the sort of thing I had in mind. So I think we need a function, a modulation function with a big M, as it were, that determines in context, given the context and the expression, which determine which modulation function in the specific sense is appropriate in this context. So those modulation functions have to be generated by some more general mechanism, but they are very specific, and they take into account the context in all its specificity.
If not, then thank you.